Flesh and blood.
Welcome back, everyone, to Session Blood episode 28. And today we're going to do a review of The Calling. Mm-hmm. So the super fun weekend, what everyone was talking about at the moment, I think. It's the hottest topic on the scene.
Exactly, and we had the front seats for that. So, we definitely know what's been going on at The Calling, so we're happy to fill you in. And next week we can focus on the other events such as Team Sealed and the Arc Sealed event as well.
Yeah, because we know people are interested in that because things, coming up, events and all that. So, our main focus is the Blitz section today, and we'll come back to that next week and deal with that. Mm-hmm. So before we begin, I suppose we'll go through some shout-outs because we've got...
Yeah, there's so many, but we'll try our best to squeeze them in there. I'll go first, and my first shout-out is to Steve McCroy, who's runs Sushi Night in Wellington. Great guy. His team won the Team Sealed event as well.
Nice.
Giving away free playmats to everyone, and just massive, just all-around great dude. So shout-out to you. I just want to say, also give a shout-out to Red Riot Games, who are hosting a big tournament online if you want to play some... online Flesh and Blood. They have like a $2,000 Canadian prize pool, and it's really big tournament, and they're welcome for anyone to join. So check out riotgames.ca, and there's all the information there. Massive shout out to Aaron Curtis, one of my faves, favorite newcomers who came second at the Calling. Massive shout out to you, and also to Sean, David, and Krishal, who throughout the tournament reached out to me saying how much Session Blood has helped them. It's really nice to hear. And a massive shout out to Kashan Rao, who's hooked us up with some giveaways that we'll be talking about in future episodes as well.
Exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, and I've got a few shout-outs, quite a few to go through as well, so we might have to do them a little bit rapid fire. My first shout-out is to Cal McCreath, who won the Arcane Rising Sealed event on the weekend. So Arcane Rising Sealed, and then drafted an incredible Wizard deck in the top 8 and walked away with a gold skull cap. So huge congrats to you. Bin me off in the final. I want to give a big shout-out to our testing team. Because they, helped us so much in the lead up to the Calling and everything like that.
Absolutely.
So that is Rohan, Tom, Jordan, Callum, Chris, and Antonio, aka the Scar Boys, represent.
Representing.
Also, an additional big shout out to Jordan and Callum for both making the top 8 of the Calling. Mm-hmm. Callum in his first event as well, so first professional level event. I also want to give a shout out to Jason Thompson, aka the Warriors captain from down in Wellington, who who took down both Carol and myself in the Swiss.
Yeah.
On Warrior vs Ira, which is actually a really tough matchup for Warrior. Mm-hmm. So, kind of crushing dreams all over the place.
Yeah, crushed my dreams of top 8ing, but...
but we still love you.
Yeah.
And I did promise them a Session Blood cap at some point, so we'll get that out.
Nice.
Also, a big shout out to Matt Rogers, who went 11-0 in the Swiss. Just playing incredibly well, as always. Mm-hmm. So him and Jacob played together, and I think Jacob managed to actually eliminate him in the lower bracket. Mm-hmm. And a huge shout out to Jacob for winning the whole tournament. Honestly, just an incredible player. Completely crushed me twice on the Ira mirror, once in the Swiss, once in the top 8. Mm-hmm. Just felt like totally out of my depth. So massive shout out to you. And shout out to Card Merchant for helping sort of organize the whole weekend. Also a shout out to the whole Dolphin Pod. You guys know who you are.
Oh yeah.
And I think with that, we do have a couple others we're going to mix in during the episode. So I think
definitely.
With that, we're just going to kick things off, move right into it, and talk about the Calling.
Yeah.
So I think one of the interesting things of the day for me was I thought there might be a few more Wizard and Runeblade players.
Yeah, so, I mean, going over the metagame, we've definitely seen Ira dominating leading up to the Calling. We saw a few events such as the Mighty Ape event where Wizard performed very well, exceptionally well.
Yep.
So those were obviously the two kind of big heroes that were going to have a great, massive presence. And those were the kind of like two key focus heroes to beat for the Calling. So the Kano and Ira matchup itself, they kind of kind of both adjust the gameplay to beat the other one. But Viserai, the one turn kill Viserai seemed like the kind of go-to counter to beat Ira. It seemed like the deck that Jason Chung managed to top 8 the Mighty Ape event, and he just destroyed the Iras on his way there, but ultimately lost to Wizard. It seems like it's got a very strong Ira matchup, but then it's incredibly hard to beat a Kano with it.
Yeah, because it almost seemed that could have been like the final part of the paper scissors rock in a way, you know, for that triangle to, because it's kind of known as the Ira killer. One thing is, I suppose it is quite a difficult deck to play.
Exactly.
And you do probably need a very refined deck list. I'm not sure if Jason's one is out there or not, but that may have been one thing holding it back a bit. But I think there only ended up being about 11 Runeblade players in total.
So just an overview from memory, I believe it was 46 Iras on the day out of 157 players. There were 23 Kano players, and there were 23 Warrior, Dorinthea players.
Yeah. And
which I feel like there was a lot of players who were gearing for a very Kano heavy metagame, but ultimately Ira was the hero to beat.
Yeah, it was interesting because we actually thought, we said on the podcast last week that it looked like the Kano players had sort of started to figure out that Ira matchup. But we did note that we felt that the Ira players would start to adapt to that a little bit more.
Exactly.
Whether that be things like Snapdragon Scalers, which, that was a bit of a metagame call. Like, some people just went the full Null Rune 4, like I believe Matt and Jacob did. Some people chose to go Snapdragon Scalers. But I feel we did see some of the Ira decks sort of lean towards a few more threats. I saw definitely things like League Tap and Snatch in decks. Definitely just putting the pressure a bit more on the Wizard player to be like, you better play everything correctly and know exactly what you're doing, or otherwise I'm just going to like burn you out in one turn kind of thing. And yeah, we also saw about 14 players on Rhino, on good old fashioned, the OG Brute. And which actually leads us into a point, because Carol and I both ended up playing Ira, but the deck we really wanted to play was
the Claw Rhino.
Claw's Brute.
It was just seemed so good. The combination of Mandible Claws and Blood Rush Bellow can just win you a game in one turn at times. But yeah, we just couldn't work out how to overcome the consistency of Ira, and I guess the ability of Ira to really prevent every point of damage.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the thing is, in the lead up to the calling, we spent a significant amount, like by far the majority of our testing time, just trying to make this deck work. So, we went through like so many different iterations. We were like refining things down, like trying different equipment. Shout out to Hayden Dale for suggesting Hardened Cross Trap.
Yeah, that was really awesome.
Which I thought was provided sort of a small breakthrough, but we just could not quite get it across the line in the end. And so it was one of those things. I know we said on the podcast last weekend for tournament preparation, try to avoid switching at last minute unless you are like fairly certain that the deck you're switching to is just the best deck in the meta. So like we got to a point where it was like 2 or 3 days out, and we just had to accept defeat. Basically, we had to accept that like we could stick to our guns, just dig our heels into the ground and say we're going to play Brute no matter what. But we just knew ultimately, as much as a shame as it was to put that deck to the side, we just felt it could not do well enough across the 11 round tournament.
Yeah, exactly. It was one of these things that we felt like if we played Brute, there would have been games that we would have lost to players who aren't particularly experienced with Ira, but just because of that matchup, we would have had basically
just go into it at a disadvantage.
Just that disadvantage.
So it was a bit of a shame because we were like very passionate about that deck. Carol's kind of the Brute king. Well, Carol's one of the original standard bearers of Brute, should I say? Like you've been definitely a big cheerleader for that class the whole way through.
Yeah, definitely.
And
I've always felt like it was an underrated class, but I feel like in this particular metagame, it just proved so hard to beat the Ira.
Yeah, so we ended up, so we switched to Ira because we thought the deck was quite cool. We played like somewhat similar lists, I suppose. I think we probably had about 3 or 4 cards different in the end.
Yeah, I think you leaned more into the kind of control...
Heavy life gain.
Yeah, heavy life gain, whereas I went more kind of mid-range and being more about applying pressure. But yeah, that is something that I definitely want to raise, is that you can see players like, Jordan, Aaron, and Callum, all 3 of them running a very kind of mid-range Ira with a lot more threats rather than playing defense reactions. And that's something we talked about in the latest podcast, and I think it's really important to point out that improves your matchup against Kano. If you don't have red fate for scenes, and instead of those you have things like snatch, leg tap, life for a life, then you actually have more threats to throw at the wizard players.
Yeah, and you brought up a card there that I really wanted to zoom in on a bit, which is life for a life. So that was a card that both Matt and Jacob ran 2 copies of, and I believe they were 2 of the only Ira players that I'm aware of that were running.
I think they were though.
Running.
There were other. I believe Brett was playing Life for Lives, but he was playing Sunkus as well, so he was going full in on the life gain strategy. But I think those are the 2 players that performed incredibly well with it and ultimately won the coin.
Yeah, and I think that sort of goes to show the importance of like preparation and testing and reps or repetitions on a certain deck. So like Life for Life was a card that, I mean, we didn't play a ton of Ira, but we had our teammates who were on that deck, so we were sort of suggesting different cards to try, different things that may or may not work. But Life for Life was definitely a card that just kind of flew under our radar. And over the course of the tournament, I feel it's not like an immediately obvious card that you would think to put in Ira. You kind of think, well, generally I want to be playing control. I want to be like, have a little bit of a life lead. So I might like get that go again. But just having the ability of a card that is an additional block threat, and like a 2 life swing in Blitz where you both players start on 20 life is just massive.
Yeah. And if you do test the mirror match, which is a really important match just because of how many Iris there were expected at the tournament, you do get into situations where it's very tight, which basically there's like a life swing, Kadachi, big attack type thing, and the life actually stays quite even, which you can abuse with cards like Life for Life. And it's extremely hard to block because if you go Kadachi, Life for Life, then you're threatening 5 damage, which cannot be blocked by a single red defense reaction. So that already forces either a red defense reaction and an equipment block, or a 2-card block.
Yeah, which is extremely relevant. We found, like, when I was playing against it, I found that card just very, very frustrating to play against because, well, like Carol mentions, when you're playing Ira, generally your equipment's, you've got your tunic, your breaking scales, and your mask of momentum. And so that's a very limited number of armor blocks throughout the game. So quite often you see players saving something like their breaking scales for if the opposing player pitches a blue card, attacks with Harmonized Kadachi, and then plays Command and Conquer for 7 because of Ira's ability. That's like a classic spot where you want to use your breaking scales. And there might be other situations where, you need that extra armor block to stop a Mask of Momentum trigger, or you just need it to block a Kadachi to try turn off their Mask trigger. So I think cards like Life for Life really put you in that position where you're being forced to commit additional cards or your equipment early, and you block out with your equipment, and then on the later turn, you also need to block out the Command and Conquer.
Yeah. So
it helps build up these incremental advantages throughout the game. On top of that, the fact is, like, you can actually, like Carol mentioned, Ira games are often very close. So you're actually able to take a bit of damage in order to try get tempo back, and then come out with this card that has Go Again that's coming for 5 with a very relevant on-hit trigger, which just, again, once they get the tempo, if they take damage to get tempo back and then strip your whole hand to get damage through, it just makes it very, very hard to come back from there.
Exactly.
And I think another point about Life for Life, I know we're going on about this a bit just because it struck us just as such an impactful card, is that one of the things in the Ira Mirror is I feel like using your flick flags efficiently can be absolutely crucial. And so quite a common thing you might see is if the other player goes attack with Kodachi and then attack with their second Kodachi for 2, is people dropping flick flag on that second Kodachi.
Yeah.
Because what that does is it then means you've blocked out the 2 damage from the Kodachi with 1 card, and it means their third card coming down can be blocked out often just by 1 card, like a blue combo card, something like a Whelming Gust Wave or a Rushing River. So anything like, Pounding Gale then gets blocked out for 5, or Command and Conquer for 6 gets blocked out by 1 card plus equipment. Life for Life really breaks up those rules in a way because you're almost never dropping flip flag on the first Kodachi. So Harmonized Kodachi comes in and then you're getting the full 5 damage on Life for Life. On top of that, in the Wizard games as well, just having a card where you can pitch 1 blue, attack with your Kodachi, then your Needle, then your Life for Life. That's representing 7 damage from 1 card.
8.
1 plus 3 plus... 8 damage with 1 card. And also just having, again against Wizard, these games come down to just the thinnest of margins.
Yeah, like having slight life lead. I feel like that's one of the reasons why Sigils so popular is also because if you have that kind of instant ability to increase your life total against Wizard, which kind of puts you out of the danger range. You could say, zone, where a Wizard can burn you for, say, 16 or 18 damage with one of their combos. But yeah, just gaining an extra life in a situation like that can just basically take you out of that danger zone.
Yeah, so it was cool seeing, because I feel like in Blitz sometimes certain decks are just necessarily going to be built in a very similar way. Like a lot of Ira decks are probably going to share maybe like 32 to 34 cards or so. So it leaves you like a limited number of flex spots. So we just find it really interesting, I think, how people dedicate those flex spots to certain cards.
Yeah.
And I think that is critical to success in Blitz.
Yeah, and the Ira Mirror, it's something that I was dreading going into the tournament.
Yeah.
Firstly, because I haven't had much practice in it, but secondly, because it's just such a grindy game. A lot of the time you just hit each other for 1, 2, and then big attack, and the whole matchup is all about those incremental advantages over the course of the game. And usually goes down to whatever you've pitched, and both players go through their decks, and Drones of Brutality play a massive part in that. But the more I've played the matchup, the more those subtleties I actually started enjoying more and more, and seeing how you can get those incremental advantages and how you can get an edge in the mirror. It just became kind of more enjoyable for me to play Ira. The more I played it, the more I enjoyed it because of how these little things mattered, and you could get an edge over your opponent through kind of playing just a little bit, doing some cheeky moves, doing kind of more efficient moves, efficient blocks, efficient attacks, and all those things add up.
Yeah, things like, attack with 1 Kodachi and you sense they've got a flick flag, so you just immediately throw out a Torrent of Tempo, for example, and then you're threatening Res, you're threatening other things. There's so many small, of course there's variance in all card games and all matchups, but I feel like the Ira, because of the way the deck is built, quite often the game is going to go for 20 plus turns, or sometimes even more.
Definitely.
And so often if you've put the practice in and you identify all these little spots, it just allows you to gain these advantages that your opponent might not be aware of over time. And I feel there's certain cards that are critical to the matchup that some of the very best players just know exactly when to use, when to save. I think a really big one for me is Snapdragon Scalers. That card is just incredible, I feel, in Ira.
Absolutely. And I feel like that's what really gives the deck just that a burst ability, an ability to change tempo. And if you're a good player and you know how to position that tempo swing, that's just game winning. Yep,
because it's just Ira by its nature is often quite a control-y deck. Chipping away with incremental advantages with Kodachis over and over again, getting small amounts of damage through. But at certain points, you can sort of identify, and I think we've talked about this before, you can identify positions where you're able to use your life as a resource in a certain way. That you can say, I'm going to take a little bit of damage here because I know on my turn I've set myself up to use the Snapdragon Scalers in a way it's very difficult for them to play around. Because cards like often when you set it up with cards like Enlightened Strike, for example, you can use Enlightened Strike to draw a card or just come in for 7 or even 8 damage on the second attack, knowing that you're putting them in a difficult position where you've got the Snapdragon Scalers available or potentially a Razor Reflex. But even cards like Torrent of Tempo, for example, it becomes very hard for the opponent to play around it when if you go like Kadachi, Torrent of Tempo, then it puts them in a position where, particularly if they block your second Kadachi hit, they think, if I block with 2 cards onto this Torrent of Tempo, they have Snapdragon Scalers available to use. If I do that and then they blow me up with a CNC, then the game's over. But also if I block it with 1 card, then they get through damage, they retain the ability to use Snapdragon later on in the game, and I'm still going to block out with my whole hand on that CNC, Command and Conquer. So that's a card that I feel is definitely can help sort of separate the very best players, the ones who've practiced a lot on the deck. A card that allows them to just, turn their controller deck into suddenly, I've got this like 19 to 20 damage turn from nowhere.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, there's a lot of small things in the Ira matchup that you look at it, and I feel like a rule, if you're playing an Ira matchup and you don't, like, you start losing and then eventually you lose and you sort of don't quite figure out why, then there's probably the other player is better and you can just figure it out.
Yeah, another thing in that particular matchup is I found that paying attention to pitch order really matters. Because if you have an opponent who, for example, keeps on pitching their red Sigils of Solace or keeps pitching their Enlightened Strikes, things like that, and you don't pay attention to it, and you might think, oh, like I have like a 4 or 5 life lead throughout the game against them, and all of a sudden, you're on, say, you're on 8 life, they're on 3 life, they blocked out your attack, and they do what we basically said, they Enlighten Strike you for 7 all of a sudden, and you're like, oh, okay, I'll use 2 cards to block that. Take 2 damage from Kadachi, another 1 damage from Kadachi, and then a powerful attack, something like a Pounding Gale for 5. All of a sudden, they managed to push a number of damage, get you down to something like 5, strip your whole hand, and then draw up to 4. And if they pitched correctly, they have another threat to go something even like a attack for 1, then attack for 7 with drone. All of a sudden, you're forced to start blocking and you're losing momentum of the game.
Definitely, and it can be even like just things as simple as just constantly checking your opponent's graveyard, like paying attention to the pitch order, checking their graveyard, seeing what have they got left in deck and what they don't. Like if you're looking through their, like if you might be formulating a plan saying, okay, well, I can do this. I'm going to take damage on my turn because next turn I'm going to force out blocks with my Kadachis or something like a Drone of Brutality, because look at their life total. They have to block no matter what. And from here, I've got the lock set up. And then you attack in your first attack, your second attack, and then you throw down your big attack and they reveal a Sigil of Solace. And suddenly you get them down to 2 life and then they lock you out of the game in the reverse. So there's just like lots, and even things like Heron's Flight, for example, that people are playing. That's a great pocket play of using Crane Dance. Playing out Crane Dance and then using your Snapdragon Scalers to activate it and playing Heron's Flight. So Heron's Flight, the combo ability on that is that you can choose, I always get this wrong, but you can choose attack actions or non-attack actions, and they can only block with a given type, something like, basically, so you can choose what they're able to block with out of those 2. And if you're not aware of that and you're saying, I've got all these defense reactions, I've got all these equipments up, like I'm fine, and then they get you for 6 damage with a Heron's Flight out of nowhere, the game's over.
Yeah, and Ira does not usually run any non-attack actions, which means that they are able to say, okay, you can only block with non-attack actions, which means you can't block with your attacks, you can't block with your equipment, you can't block with your defense reactions. So a lot of the time that's literally just says 5, attacking you for 5 unblockable. And if you have breaking scales, that's 6 unblockable. If it's your second attack, that's 7 unblockable. So that can really take people out of surprise. And by surprise. And when you combine it with something like Razor Reflex, that can just blow someone out.
Yep, and that's actually how I got knocked out of the tournament by my friend and one of my teammates, Callum Giddens, who actually got me with the Heron Slide. So I was playing around for the certain particular game state, and he had no cards left in deck, I had very few, and then I realized just sort of a little bit too late that he was setting up this play, and I was like, I've got Sigil of Solace, but it was just too much, and he killed me. So I think Ira mirrors, there's a lot more going on underneath the surface than might originally appear.
Exactly.
But I suppose moving on, I mean, we can circle back and continue talking about some Ira interactions, but I feel like we need to talk about Wizard a little bit as well.
Definitely.
Because Wizard was the deck, like Ira and Wizard kind of made up the 1-2 punch we felt of the format. So, this really strong, control-y mid-range deck that could really punish a lot of the aggro decks. And we thought Kano would be sort of the natural counter to this, being able to set up like its huge combos and things like that.
Yeah, and definitely trying to finish the game as quickly as possible. Kano has that tendency to really do a lot of burst damage and has that ability to finish games and sometimes even turn 1, 2, or 3.
Yep.
So that just naturally screams like a decent counter to a deck that has like Ira that does have those incremental advantages. The main difference and the reason why I think that they weren't as many Kano players as Ira players is the deck is just really hard to just pick up.
Yep.
If I had the time, I probably would have preferred to go and play Kano rather than Ira. But just because it was a week before the tournament or so, I wasn't able to do that because the deck just requires so much more skill and patience.
Yep, absolutely. And definitely, like if you're making like a last minute switch to a certain deck, or like you feel it's some like you kind of could go one way or the other, I think that's a really good point, particularly over 11 rounds as well. That's I do feel like we mentioned there is a lot of skill in playing Ira at the very, very high level.
Definitely.
But again, I would say all in all, it's probably like an easier deck to play than Kano.
I feel it's easier to do well with. Kano, they both have a really high skill cap, but Kano is extremely punishing if you make a mistake, whereas Ira is a lot more forgiving when you make a mistake.
Definitely, because like in Blitz, any small mistake can actually sink you, like no matter what deck you're playing. But I believe Carol's right that if you make a misblock on Ira, it is going to punish you. But because your deck is so consistent and that it like almost always lets you get to your game plan or play in a particular way, you can actually recover from that. Whereas on Wizard, if you mess up your pitch order, for example, or you just miscalculate even the smallest thing, like you think you have lethal damage but you're one resource short and you burn everything out, like then you just lose on the spot a lot of the time. So I think that the combination of it requiring a lot of practice to like probably a lot more practice to get to like very, very high level on, plus having to play 11 rounds and play them perfectly, I think the Kano players suffered a little bit from that.
Definitely.
And one thing though that I wanted to mention about Kano, because we're talking about things like Life for Life and Ira as a cool innovation we liked, is we saw Blue Unmovable make an appearance.
So yeah, massive props to Jason Long and Dan McKay.
I believe they tested with each other because I think they were playing with similar, if not the same list.
Yeah, but both of them basically were using the Blue Unmovable as a countermeasure to Needle. So both of them played kind of your standard Kano list that you have your burn spells, you have your blues and things like that, but they have added in 2 unmovables as a measure, which didn't affect their pitch order at all, so they weren't forced to use something like a red defense reaction, which kind of punishes you in other matchups such as Kano Mirror. Or just anything that the red defense reaction isn't as useful against. But you have that option to destroy the Needle. So you don't get punished in the matchup like the Mirror, but you do have that edge against Ira, which I found it's probably, definitely a great meta call, and it definitely took a lot of people by surprise. But not only that, they kind of had that backup strategy where they play a normal kind of game as Kano, they can burn you out really quickly. But if they find that you start if they see that their opponent is kind of trying to slow the game down, they are able to set up that one turn kill combination of something like forked lightning, stir the other ones into forked lightning, into double blazing on the bottom of their deck, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, because the blue unmovable, it's not the most obvious thing, I think, first up, because you look at it as a card that, on Kano, like I don't want to brick on my Kano and hit the blue unmovable, and then suddenly I lose the game because I can't get rid of it or something like that. But yeah, I think, like Carol mentioned, again, just like a really good metagame call. Like I believe they probably saw the writing on the wall and figured there are going to be a lot of Ira, maybe even more than we thought, and being able to win those games in the rounds of Swiss is more important than having, say, potentially a slightly weaker mirror match.
Yeah.
Because I do think that, again, I'm no expert Wizard player by any means, but I do feel the presence, if you have 2 blue unmovable, would just necessarily make your mirror a little bit weaker.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if you're playing a Kano mirror, or you're playing any game as Kano, and you do a blind Kano ability, whether it's something like a blue zap, let's say, or a blue unmovable, the difference is so minimal in those situations that it's not as punishing, where the benefit of having a card like unmovable against decks like Ira, Bravo, Warrior, those can be extremely beneficial to have.
Because I think actually I'm not sure if we stated that, like, the big thing about the blue unmovable is that it breaks Zephyr Needle. Because we might have just glossed over that a little bit, but that's such a huge thing, because the 100% standard sort of, the things that you present your weapons against Wizard is you play Harmonized Kodachi and Zephyr Needle, because your Zephyr Needle, because of Ira's ability, is attacking for 3, and Wizard just doesn't play defense reactions, or almost never. Like there may be some versions around here and there that run something like 1 red Fate Foreseen, or run red like Absorbent Ether, for example. But by and large, you feel very confident playing that, and you need to put the pressure on, because you simply cannot give them just infinite time to set up and set up and set up. And so by having cards like blue unmovable, you can sometimes effectively almost win the game on turn 1, because your opponent goes first, they attack with Harmonized Kodachi, they attack with Zephyr Needle, you play blue unmovable, and if they don't have like the Razor Reflex there, like on the spot to buff it up, then
it breaks.
Then it breaks.
There's like all that incremental advantage that we talked about is just so much harder to put on pressure when one of your main sources of constant damage is destroyed. So it creates situations where Ira can't go as wide as it normally can with that needle. So things like, Kodachi, Zephyr Needle into Enlightened Strike for 7, let's say, just becomes Kodachi Enlightened Strike for 8.
Yep.
Which is a lot of tempo lost and a lot of ability to put on pressure, especially in the versions that run for null rune equipment. The versions that don't run the scalers just means that they lack that kind of burst to really put pressure on the Wizard.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the thing is, if you lose your needle, the game isn't, like, depending on when it happens, it might like, if they don't break the needle until like towards the very end of the game, then you may have put on enough pressure to still just get there.
Definitely.
But if you lose the needle in, like, say, for example, your first 2 or 3 turns, it renders the game like extremely difficult to win. Like, I mean, I feel against a good Wizard player, your win percentage must drop like massively, like, because you lose one of your key outsource. Like, you have a card that for 1 resource deals 3 damage with Go Again every single turn, and that's just gone from your deck.
And it's so extremely efficient, and forces the Wizard player to just react instantly.
Yeah, so, and the thing is, we mentioned before that, because I feel their decks, I unfortunately didn't get to see them play a whole lot, but from my understanding, they certainly played towards more of one-turn kill style playstyle of Wizard. So the deck can play out like a standard Wizard deck with, your traditional blues, some variations of, red Wizard non-attack actions, the usual suspects, that kind of thing. But also they had this game plan where, and it's not, like, once you know how to do it, it's not the hardest thing to actually set up. I mean, I'm not trying to take away from their skill or anything, because to play that so consistently over a full day, I've got nothing but respect. Like, I could not have done that by any means. But when I say it's once you know how to do it, it's not crazy hard to set up. Like, I think there might be this misperception that you have to keep track of, like, so many different moving parts, and, like, you have to remember the pitch order of your entire deck and everything. But the way it works, because I think we did it in a video one time, is once you pitch your 4 combo piece. Once you pitch 4 blues to the bottom of your deck, and then you pitch the necessary combo pieces, so your Blazing Aethers, your Stir, and your Forked. It just means that, like, from there you can be like, okay, well, I've got the stack of cards. When I get to those 4 blues, I just have to pay attention, like, how far through my deck is those 4 blues to the bottom. So then you just start the count. You're like, okay, now it's 10 cards. Now it's like 15 cards till I get my 4 blues. Now it's 10 cards. Now it's 6 cards. You have things like Talismanic Lens, which you can use to manipulate your deck if you mess up the pitch order a little bit, or speed you up towards the combo. You have cards like Eye of Ophidia, which perform a similar role. And once you practice that and do it a lot of times, it just becomes simple math. You say, okay, well, it's X cards away, this many cards away. And once you get it, it's almost nothing they can do. Like, short of something like Irena's Prayer, that combo just puts out way too much damage. Because, like, this, like, Stir the Aether Winds with everything, like your Crucible of Aetherweave, your Metacarpus Nodes, that comes in for, like, 14 damage. So even if they block 4 of it, that's still 10 damage coming through. Your Blazing Aether then comes in for 10. If they block 4 of that, that's still 6 coming through. And then your next one comes in for 16. So it stacks up to, like, 32 damage in a turn, even with all your sigil and everything. Like, if you're not aware of that, you're dead.
Yeah.
So
basically, it's incredibly hard, if not impossible, without some major life gain to survive that.
Yeah, and it all goes off at instant speed. So, like, you need to be extremely aware of what they're doing in order to disrupt it. But yeah, so I thought things like the blue removal were quite, like, a cool innovation. Just a bit of a metagame called this How I Can Beat Ira. I still feel there are ways to beat Ira without the unmovable. But again, I think when you're playing, like, a very big tournament like that, why not make your day a little bit easier, you know? Like,
yeah, definitely. It's a nice kind of plan B, you could say, or just a little bit of an edge versus the most commonly seen list. So yeah, I feel mad props to them for testing it and getting extremely consistent with it. I mean, Jason Long top 8'd, which just shows that he was able to consistently pull off these kind of advantages in his games.
These big moves, yeah. Because then the thing is, you might think, well, later on in the tournament, when, like, people are aware of who the top players in the Swiss and top 8 are, like, you don't have that surprise value because people will be like, oh, by the way, he's running blue unmovable. But the thing is, if they decide to run Zephyr Needle over the Kodachi, like, that's almost a win by itself.
Yeah, if you're forcing your opponent to say, hey, they have a blue unmovable, I'm just going to play a Kodachi instead, that's already a win. That's already you're saving yourself 1 point of life every turn.
Yeah, and exactly. And, like, whether it's still correct to run the Kodachi and the Needle, even if you know they have it or not, I think some Ira players had a bit different opinions on that. I haven't played that matchup enough, so I'm not quite sure, but I do know there was a little bit of a debate, I think, or different opinions from some of the players in the top 8, whether you just still play Needle anyway, and just say, like, you know, I'm going to play Needle. I have got things like Razor Reflex to back my thing up. If you don't draw it early enough, even if you break it in the very late game, I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Interesting.
I mean, it does forces a 2-card reaction where they have to pitch a blue to play a blue. So that already kind of weakens their 1 turn. But in the long run, obviously it's a benefit to the Wizard player.
Yeah, that's the thing. So even though Wizard didn't perform maybe quite as well as we expected it to on the day, although, you know, it was very, very close. Like, our good friend Rohan, unfortunately, on tiebreakers, just missed out and came 9th on Wizard. So we were, like, this close to having a double Wizard top 8.
Definitely.
So I wouldn't say, like, all is despair. Like, Wizard cannot win, because that's simply not true. But I think even though it didn't perform quite as well as we thought it would, it definitely influenced a lot of metagame decisions.
Yeah.
I think we saw certain Ira decks running up to like 17 blue cards, and I think some of that is kind of a nod to the wizard deck saying I need to minimize the amount of times that I draw like the dreaded quad red hands, or I draw 3 reds and a blue, and I just give them this huge window to beat me. I think even the warrior decks as well, which is definitely a deck I want to talk about a little bit. The warrior decks, I think I spoke to Jason Thompson, who told me that, so he was the sole Dorinthea, he's the sole Dorinthea player to make top 8, and he mentioned to me that he adjusted his deck a little bit because he thought the Ira decks might be going a little bit more aggro / mid-range in order to combat the Kano decks that seem to be doing so well. So there's all these like ripple effects that...
And that's definitely a good spotting, because in a previous podcast we mentioned that the Ira decks might lean more towards going mid-range from control to be able to put the pressure on the Kano decks, which means that by taking out those defense reactions, all of a sudden decks like Warrior became stronger. And it's something that I definitely noticed because I lost to 2 Warrior players. One was to John, who came second at Nationals with Dorinthea, and the other one was Jason. So those 2 matchups where I definitely felt not as confident. I still feel that Ira has a really good game against Warrior, but because I've trimmed down my defense reactions to the 6 flick flags and 1 sink below, I definitely felt a lot more exposed to Warrior.
Yeah, because Warrior, once, like, if they can burn through some of your defense reacts and put you in a position where you don't have one, it can make it very difficult to deal with. And I remember looking and thinking, like, I felt Warrior might not have done, like, quite as well as we thought. But then if you look at the numbers, there were 23 Warrior players, which is roughly about 15% or so of the total tournaments. And they ended up being 1 Warrior in the top 8, which is, like, roughly around the same percentage. I do think there were some like very good Warrior players there on the day. I also think though that the deck did suffer from there just being so many Ira players. Like even I know like Jason managed to just like crack through it. You know, he beat both of us playing Ira. But I think in a way it's almost similar to the brute deck that we tried, in that once you play against these Ira players who are inherently really good players like Matt and Jacob and stuff like that, who, Aaron Curtis, who came second, did extremely well, Callum, Jordan, all these Ira players made the top 8. It does, I feel, just become an inherently difficult matchup when you have to consider things like Wizard as well, and when you have to consider more aggressive Ira variants. I think if the metagame had just been dominated completely by more sort of control-y Ira decks in the lead up to the tournament, I feel like we might have actually potentially seen a second Dorinthea or even a Kasai in the top 8, because they are able to very narrowly focus on beating these decks, and they do have a path to beating these decks, but when there's so many different things going around, I think it made that a bit difficult for them.
Yeah, definitely. And it's Warrior, I actually thought was well positioned because of that, because of people taking out defense reactions from the Ira lists. But I think what it suffers from is that you have a very short window against Ira. So basically, if the Ira player is able to kind of sustain their life total quite high, if you can't punch through the damage, then to Kodachi chip away, once your armor wears off, then you become extremely vulnerable to... You have to take a lot of hits to create these big hands that Warrior kind of needs to push through damage. So a lot of the kind of advantage that Warrior has is like if you have a five card hand, 4 in hand, 1 in arsenal, something like a potion out, and you go for something like a Steelblade Supremacy with Spoils of War, something like that. That presents a huge threat. But as soon as you kind of lower that down to 2-3 cards, it becomes a lot more manageable for Ira to defend that. Yeah,
and I think if your big turn doesn't come through, so often I felt, and again, I'm not the best Warrior player or anything, but I feel one theme seemed to be, we've seen people talk about the Warrior fridge, as in like their armor is so big that it's like getting through a fridge, that because they can block up to 7 in one turn between their Bolters, Skullcap, Courage of Blade Hold, and Brave Lord's Braces, that I feel they would often commit in one turn where they use their equipment to just block one attack, and then on their turn they protect that 5-card hand and go all in. But I do think, like you mentioned, if you're able to shut down that big turn or stop it, then it becomes sort of just a lot more difficult to actually power through and win those games. I think on a general note as well, the thing about a deck like Ira is that it has so much built-in redundancy to the deck, and by that I mean all your you have so many cards that you don't care if you lose them from your deck or not. So you have so many blues, if you have to block with a Rushing River or Whelming Gustwave blue, or
really don't
you don't care, like a Drone of Brutality that just goes back on the bottom of your deck. Even your threats, things like a Pounding Gale, Flying Kick, there's so many cards that it just doesn't matter if you block with them, because you're eventually, I've still got the drones coming back over and over again.
Exactly.
That's just situation. Whereas I think decks like Wizard can kind of get away a bit with it as well. They have to manage their threats, because if they spend too long blocking, then by the time they kind of realize what's going on, the game's over, because they just don't have enough threats left to kill you. But I think Warrior is definitely a deck that's somewhat susceptible to that. Even just having to go second sometimes, which again, some Warrior players actually prefer going second rather than first. But if I'm an Ira player and I go attack with Kodachi, attack with my second Kodachi, they block out a card, which is the correct play, and then you play a Drone of Brutality. And then if the Warrior player is holding, if your hand's something like Steelblade Supremacy, Singing Steelblade, Iron Soul Determination, or Spoils of War, 3 of these cards that are really critical to your game plan, and you just because that happened to, I played against Jason Thompson, losers bracket the top 8, and that was just the exact situation. So he ended up having to block with, I think, a Singing Steelblade and a Route or something like that. And it's just these cards that like these, I really need these cards, because if I don't have these, my opponent can just see they're in the graveyard. And once I use my other copies, I don't have to worry about it for the rest of the game.
Yeah, imagine having to block with 2 Glints early or something like that. These crucial cards that kind of keep your game plan together. And yeah, as the game goes on, the Kodachi heads become more threatening, because it's a higher percentage of your life. You don't have the armor. If you have to start blocking with the threats, not only are you blocking with the threats, but you're giving more and more information to your opponent. As in, from the Iris perspective, if I look through my opponent's graveyard, see that they've used all their Singing Steelblades, they've used all the Iron Song responses, it becomes a lot easier to play around. Yeah,
because when you understand that, I no longer need to play around Reprise, because, all but one of their Reprise cards are gone. They've got, a blue Iron Song response left. I don't care about that. You can actually just look through their graveyard quickly and say, well, okay, now the math is you've got, one of these left in your deck. So I know if I block in this way, it's never getting through. I'm just completely safe. I can just block out like this and I'm fine. And I think, props to the solid Warrior players who, people like Jason, who managed to still navigate that field and play it in a particular way to keep up the pressure and keep you guessing enough to do it. But I do feel Warrior, just as a deck in general, that was kind of one of his issues I felt in the tournament.
I feel like the matchups, you have to be such a on-point player to... I feel like it is a little bit of an uphill battle, but... props to him for kind of pushing through and winning 8 games.
Because I think 9 games. He went 9-2.
Yeah, 9-2. Yeah.
That's my claim to my 3 losses in the Swiss were first, second, and third. So, I'm just saying. Well, after the Swiss at least. But and I think that was a similar issue for decks like Brute, which we played a lot. So again, Brute and Warrior, very different decks, but when we were playing Brute, we have a lot of cards that we can throw away, like our yellow pitch 6-power cards that are just there to enable the Intimidate Rhino ability, things like Blood Rush Bellow. But you can actually just get in a position where you're playing towards these 2 big Blood Rush Bellow turns, or a turn where you combine them both, and you just take often if you don't draw it early enough, you just take so much damage that it becomes very, very difficult to catch up, particularly on a deck like Rhino, where when you're on your big turns, you're actually intimidating away cards, but then they still get all those cards back for their turn. So it's maybe you're down to 7 life and you drop this huge turn and get them down to 6. But then that's just not good enough, because then on their turn, they're like, okay, I'm going to threaten like up to 12 damage. And it just really becomes like a big slog. I think if you're playing those types of decks, I think they can actually still be good in the meta, and they can be tuned to do well. But you just absolutely need to practice against your difficult matchups. And you need to be like perfectly aware of everything the Ira players and the Wizard players and stuff are doing. Because I think, they're very, very punishing for little mistakes or not taking advantage of your windows.
Yeah, definitely. And in Classic Constructed, Brute has a great game against Wizard. I feel like it's one of, if not the best matchup that Brute can have, purely because of how Intimidate works in relation to the Kano's activated ability and playing at instant speed. It just kind of cuts down. It really punishes the Wizard from making misplay, using a Kano ability in response to something like a barraging beatdown. And then just getting completely kind of beat down. But because of how life works in Blitz, the burn becomes exponentially more powerful, and even it's just a lot harder to beat a good Wizard.
And I think there's even things that we may even see that shift in Classic Constructed a little bit as some of these players return from playing Kano and Blitz to Kano and Constructed and take a lot of their knowledge with them. Because a little tip for some of the Wizard players out there, for cards like Tome of Aetherwind and Tome of Fyendale, one thing that can be incredibly frustrating as a Brute player is like you line up this huge turn and you're just going like you're
intimidate.
You're like going intimidates the Wizard players holding their cards and you're thinking like this is it, like it's over. So you intimidate a bunch of your cards. You have cards like Barraging Beatdown, which if they can't block with 2 cards, that's really important because if they can't block with 2 cards, you get the bonus damage. They're not running defense reacts, so you run out all these cards and then they have something, they use their Talismanic Lens and they banish something like a Tome of Aetherwind, or they might have the Tome of Aetherwind in Arsenal and can use like Stormstriders, and then at that point they can just wait for you to run out all your Intimidates, and then you come in with this big attack, and then they just play the Tome of Aetherwind, which is in the banish zone. It's totally safe from Intimidates. They play that, draw 2 cards, and just block with 2 cards. And then you might have got some damage through, but you were relying on this turn to win you the game. And then they just they get all the cards that you've intimidated, get them straight back to their hand, and they're like, sweet, turn. Now it's my turn. I've got a full hand.
Yeah, exactly.
So again, like not that Brute is a bad deck by any means, but it's just like little things that when I think old tricks that may have used to work when the game was a little bit younger. I think you can't really get away with these as much anymore. Like you just really need to be aware of like all these interactions and all these little things, because like the other player is going to like
you can definitely get blown out. That's a pocket play that can really take a Brute player out by surprise. Like something like, oh, you're gonna intimidate me, I'll pitch to Kano, put a Tome of Aetherwind in the banish zone, and I can wait. I can wait for you to run all your Intimidates, and then once you're finished, I'll just draw 2 cards.
Because that's the thing, and again, being aware of like what they've pitched and what's in the graveyard are very important. Because if you look at their graveyard and they've got, because a lot of Wizards run 2 Tome of Aetherwind, 2 Tome of Fyendale, and if even things like being aware, do they have a counter on their Tunic? Because if they have no energy potions and playing stuff like that, and they've got like no counters on Tunic, if you look at their graveyard and see, they've got 2 Tome of Aetherwind in there, then you're actually very protected against this play because they can't use the Tome of Fyendale. But if they've got 3 counters on Tunic, 1 Tome of Aetherwind in graveyard, and Blitz, you're thinking, okay, well, their outs here, they got 2 Tome of Aetherwinds left, or they can banish the Tome of Fyendale, and with that Tunic, they have access to play that at instant speed. So all these little things all these things we kind of ran into, I feel, when we were playing Brute. We're like, it's by no means I play against Wizard, it's a free win, I can play Bonehead Barrier, which, so...
You have to pitch to, and it just becomes messy.
Yeah, so...
I feel like there's definitely a lot to talk about Blitz still. I feel like it's still a lot of things to discover. I feel like we will see a a lot of players adjust to the metagame, and I feel like if Ira continues to go the path to going a little bit more aggro and cut defense reactions, then things like Warrior, Guardian, those kinds of decks will become more relevant again. And if when people start figuring out Kano a bit more and we get better players on Kano, I feel like it's going to be a lot harder for Iris to win. And same thing with the OTK Viserai. That's a deck that you can just make if everybody plays Iras and you master that deck and you go to a tournament, you're just going to win against every Ira.
Yeah, and when we say like better players on Kano, that's like no dig at the current Kano players, of which there's like a lot of very good ones.
What I meant is like a bigger...
Like pool, sort of.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing, like Kano takes a lot of time to actually get really good on. And the thing is, like, if we just have a bigger pool of Kano players who are constantly practicing then and who like really like sort of zoom in on that Ira matchup, then we could see those results start to change a little bit as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and a deck like Guardian, for example, that we saw Kale McCreath play, I feel like he figured out quite a good strategy against Wizard, but again, just some difficulties with Ira, but I've heard that matchup can be adjusted as well with cards like Emerging Dominance.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like Guardian's one of those decks that you can run things like Emerging Dominance in red, which is extremely powerful against Ira because you can get your Crippling Crushers dominated attacking for 14, which is that kind of number that is extremely hard for Iris to block. But then that card is not very good against Kano. And against Kano, you want to run things like Red Pummels, which is a great card to blow out Kano players and kind of like seal the deal when they're trying to block, stay on low life. But then you kind of have both because you have a very limited slots for red cards. So it's tricky, but I feel like Guardian is still just a solid staple of the format.
Yep. So I feel we've sort of covered most of... I mean, like, we could talk forever about Blitz. It's a very interesting format. I suppose, just wrapping up, there's a couple of final things. I actually just thought of when you mentioned like things like Emerging Dominance versus Pummel, and it's like very difficult choosing one over the other. I think one sort of lesson I took out of the weekend as well is that in a format with 40 cards and where there's no sideboarding, you need to be very, very careful about playing like your secret tech one-ofs that like it might be good in this like one situation and like, you know, if I get this off, it's amazing. I would caution against that because all your cards matter so much. I feel in Blitz that, like, for example, I played like a Tome of Findale in my Ira list, and I was like, you know, sometimes I can get it off with this and it'll be really cool. And I felt like largely I just wasn't properly aware of how that card was supposed to function in my deck. So its most common use was blocking a Kadachi for 2 over the course of the day. Great, you know, yes. Whereas if that's a life for a flying kick, that's another threat in my deck, and it's like actually really relevant. So if you want to play tech cards, I don't want to put you off that. I think that's actually really cool. Like maybe Chains of Eminence makes a comeback, things like that. But I think you need to be practicing with reps. You have to note down in your testing how often this comes up and how often is it just a dead card in your hands. Because if it's once in every 10 games, it's great. And then, you know, every other game, it's a card that blocks for 2 when it could just be something better, then you need to focus on that. And the final thing is we're really looking forward to seeing a bit more like Blitz action because some skirmish events have been announced. Yeah,
so it's going to be interesting to see the way LSS is approaching kind of tournaments on a smaller scale than your kind of callings and stuff, but that are available to play online. So there will be tournaments run in kind of all kinds of areas of the world where you can tune in and play with a webcam setup.
Yeah, and actually finally, just before we forget, because we did get a message from one of the players in the UK scene, and so we just wanted to give who we've been told there's like sort of a flourishing scene over there, more players joining every day, so we just want to give a big shout out to the UK scene. Like we love all the communities growing, but we did get a message from there, so we want to give a shout out to all of you and say we look forward to the scene growing. We can't wait to see all your different metagames growing with all skirmishes around the world. And yeah, I think that's about us for today. Thank you for tuning in. We probably went a little bit longer, as we always tend to do when we get interested about things. We will next week. We'll kind of circle back around a bit. We might talk a little bit on Blitz if there's more developments, but our main focus is going to be looking at the Team Sealed and the Arcane Rising Sealed.
Arcane Rising Sealed.
Because Arcane Rising Sealed, I believe that's potentially a skirmish format as well, and we're really excited to get into that. Runeblade Pile, it's coming next week.
Yeah, Runeblade Pile. All right.
Well, thank you everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
See you then. Bye.